Welcome everyone to the Gallinas Watershed Council's monthly meeting. I'm Judy Friedman. I'm one of the founders of the group and the current secretary. And all things water are of interest to me. I'm also on the Las Gallinas Valley Sanitary District Board, which takes care of all the sewage in this lovely 94903 area. So that's me. We can pass. Actually, we'll pass to Jules this way. We'll go around clockwise.
I'm Jules Evans. I lived in West Marin for many years, but I've done a lot of work in the greater Bay Area. I'm mostly on tidal marshland, and I'm going to share a tiny little portion of that work with you tonight regarding Gallinas Creek, or slough it should be called.
I'm Rachel Kamen. I'm a hydrologist and engineer, and I've worked, I've lived in the watershed and worked with the Watershed Council for about 10 years. Also had the pleasure of working with Jules for maybe even longer than that. And so I'm really looking forward to what he has to share with us today.
My name's Alana Springer. I recently started volunteering with the Civic Center Water Restoration Group. I'm also a grad student studying anthropology, and I grew up in Santa Benicia.
Great. Len, why don't we go to you?
Lynn Blooming, Marin Audubon Society, Audubon Canyon Ranch. I met Rachel about 12 years ago, and her husband. I'm interested in the Ridgway Rail and any potential threats to its local obsoletus population. Is it still called obsoletus?
Obsoletus.
Wow.
Feel free.
Yeah.
How about John, the man behind the camera? And then
Yeah, the man behind the camera, John Carolus, lifelong environmentalist, former Greenpeace crewman and cameraman. And why I'm here is because I have a long interest in the Clapper Rail, now known as the Ridgway. Try to protect it here at Gallinas Creek, and is very active. Wait.
have a seat right here, Kate. Yeah, or wherever. We're doing introductions around this way, so we'll catch up with, but please take a seat anywhere you'd like. Closer to the screen is usually
This seat
going
will
to
be
be
free in a
better.
few minutes.
I'm Tom Balo, a longtime friend of Jules. I live in West Marin. I belong to the Audubon Society, and I'm hoping someday to get a glimpse of this beautiful bird called the Ridgway Rail.
No, Clapper.
Actually,
Clapper, right?
and I appreciate the ponds that you guys are in charge of over there. It was wonderful there. Thank you.
Great. Let's bounce back to you, if we may.
Well, I'm Susan Kelly.
And you're here because?
I'm here because I lead field trips at Las Gallinas. Len and I used to do them together, and I will be on the Marin Audubon board starting in June.
Great.
My name is Courtney Gutman. I'm with the Richardson Bay Audubon Center and Sanctuary, also Audubon, California, and I'm a restoration projects manager working with climate adaptations in tidal marshes, Aramburu Island, and Sonoma Creek in Hanson.
Aramburu Island is a cool project.
I'm Ellen Stone. I'm on the Santa Benicia Dredging Board.
Great. Thank you.
I'm Arlene Davis. I'm interested in the Clapper Rail. I'm also an environmentalist and do a lot of wildlife rehab, particularly bird stuff and international bird rescue. And
So
I
you
live
with
in Santa
Wild
Benicia.
Care then too?
I was at Wild Care for about 20 years. I'm currently at bird rescue. And I've lived in Santa Benicia. And,
Well, if you're not a member yet, we need you, but you're probably not.
I'm not Santa Benicia. I'm an SBNA member.
Yeah, very good. Well, we need you at GWC too, that's all. Just expanding your membership, that's, I'm always going to do that. Please,
I'm
back.
Ray Lorber, the
Great.
treasurer of Gallinas Watershed Council.
And then behind you?
Ron Mallory.
South Benicia
Let's talk about
resident, birder, famous
Avid bird.
avid bird. Great.
Russ Greenfield. Live in Santa Benicia. I'm part of the Watershed Council, and it's really nice to see so many people here tonight. Welcome.
He's actually the president of the watershed, so he's very shy and retiring.
Excuse me for having dinner back here.
I'm Kate Powers. I'm currently the president of Marine Conservation League, and I have been active in the Gallinas Watershed Council years ago.
Carolyn Leonard, I'm a neighbor here in Terralinda.
I'm Vicki Jackson from Santa Fe, just like birds.
Okay. Did I say who I was? I think we started with me. Is there
Yes, you
anyone
did.
else that we didn't get to? No. Well, thank you again all for coming. If you haven't signed in, if you would please, it really helps when we go for grants and we say how many people show up at things. It's really nice for me to have something like that because I don't remember numbers or things afterwards. And we've got one more person to just please introduce yourself to the group.
I'm Susan Jansen. I'm from Oak Valley and member of Marin Audubon, and I've met Jules before.
Yeah.
Excellent. Good to see you. Thank you for coming. Okay, so I think we can jump into your talk then, Jules. That's what everybody is here for.
Okay.
Jules Justice, but Jules is a passionate advocate for wildlife, an observer and cultivator of clapperels, and among all and many consort species. And his work observing, studying, and understanding these animals has really led the effort to preserve and protect them and their habitat, and to understand how we impact their habitat and how we can maintain it in the future. So I brought one of the more recent documents that Jules has contributed to in terms of the body of knowledge of information about wildlife species in San Francisco Bay, the outer coast, and Tomales Bay, and pretty much anywhere you can imagine. And Jules's writing is long and wide. I strongly encourage people to read up and to use the information that he provides and presents in the strongest possible way to support clapperel. Thanks, Jules.
Thank you. And I've worked with Rachel, as she said, for probably 2 decades, I guess, on and off, and she's the one who implements all this information. She and Greg, her husband, are hydrologists, and they make, when you come up with ideas, they sometimes actually happen because of these wonderful people moving dirt around and water around. So I've been studying, among other species, Ridgway's rail since 1981, formerly known as the California clapper rail. It was recently, 2 years ago, I believe, split into 3 separate taxa. But it's still the same bird, but it has a different name, and I'll get to that in a second. Next slide, please. Rachel.
Oh, that's me.
So the California...
So I was like, next.
This is the California Ridgway's rail, and you notice the name, which has changed recently, is rail. It's in the group, the genus rail. Obsoletus, kind of an ominous name. They're one of the rare birds in California and in North America. They're on the endangered species list since, I think, 1971, about since the ESA started. Because of very limited habitat. They only occur on the coast of California from San Francisco Bay and occasionally Tomales Bay, south into Baja California. Very tidal marsh dependent birds, and I'll get into that a little. First I'll talk about their habitat requirements and then sort of focus down to their local distribution. The rail's about chicken size. In fact, it's in the same family as the chickens, and they used to be called marsh hens because that's where they found them. In the late 1800s, they were hunted heavily in San Francisco Bay and sold in the market for food. So that was the first sort of major impact to their abundance. And since then, we've altered the landscape dramatically, and that's had even more of an impact than the original hunting did. You can see they're long-legged, they're very furtive, they're hard to see, and I'll explain how we detect them in a few minutes. But this is where they forage, on the tidal sloughs, in the mud along the tidal sloughs and under the overhanging banks, which you can't see here, but this is pickleweed overhanging the bank of the slough. Next please. So the way we detect them is we sample a marsh by listening for their calls, and they call at dawn and dusk. They're very crepuscular if the conditions are right, and I'll show you a picture later where our stations are located along a given slough, like Gallinas Creek. And So because they're so furtive and hard to see, we do most of the censusing and population estimation by sound, listening to the birds. And notice this guy. Can you guys see him back all right? See those breast sacs on him is what he produces his sound with. They're very loud when they call, but they don't call very often unless there's a high density of birds in the marsh. So I'll again talk about that more later. I just wanted to give you a physical idea of what they look like, and that's in their habitat at the edge of a spartina bed. There's taller monocots and justitiolus or saltgrass and pickleweed, the common marsh plants. And another species that occurs in similar habitat, a little higher in the marsh elevations, the California black rail, much smaller than the Ridgway's rail, about the size of a robin without a tail, very small, and even more secretive than the clapper rail. Most people don't ever get to see them in their lifetime, and I've been studying them for about 30 years and probably seen 24 maybe ever. But again, with them, you hear them.
How did you get this picture?
Yeah.
Lying on the belly, just responding to a tape, which I'll show in a minute. Actually, go back one. I want to play some sound so you know. Yeah, there you go. So when they call, they're not songbirds. Their calls are not terribly musical. But I'm going to play a sound. I hope you can hear this. Can you hear that in back? That's several birds clattering at one another and the way they communicate between territories. I didn't say, but I meant to say that they're very territorial. That's a single bird. And sedentary. They're not big migrants. They're pretty much on their same territory most of their life. So you can imagine standing out there in a marsh at dawn and hearing a slew of birds calling from the slough, how difficult it is to estimate how many there are. And we're usually pretty conservative about that, but often the way those sounds travel, you can hear maybe 2 or 3 pair from one spot, and that's it. We make some assumptions about that. And I think I have another song. Let's see if this is a different one. That's the same. One more. There's a very rare song that I was hoping was on here, but I didn't have time to check everything. It's a female call, which is a little different. So we do know when they're females advertising, they go kick-kicker, kick-kicker. Next slide, please. So you can skip that's the California black rail, which we census in much the same way, but we're not going to discuss that now. Too big a subject for this. So Gallinas, here's the mouth of Gallinas Creek. And I just want you to note right here, and just notice how extensive the marshland is up here out on the bay shore of San Pablo Bay and down here near Jake's Island or China Camp. It's quite a bit historically, these marshes went way back, much further up than they do now. But still, for San Francisco Bay, that's a large marsh, probably 300 hectares, maybe 500 acres. And next slide, please. We're going to move upstream. So this area is the broad marsh. As you move upstream, it gets quite linear. And that's the area we're going to be talking about mostly because that's our area of interest, actually the north branch. This is the north branch of Gallinas Creek and the south branch down to Santa Venetia. And notice how it's bound by infrastructure, pretty much, the south branch. The north branch is as well, but less so.
Jules,
Yes.
are those the ponds up on the top?
Right there?
Those are the wildlife ponds?
Yes, because there's Miller Creek.
Okay, and then the golf course is?
This is the
That's the
golf course. There's the clubhouse, I guess, or the driving range, maybe. We have a closer one next. Although you'll lose the sewage ponds in the next. Yeah, you can leave it there a minute. Actually, bring the next one, then we can come back. So this is a little further upstream or closer view. So here's the north branch, Gallinas Creek. That's where the SMART train goes across. Here's Santa Venetia down here, which we've covered less because there are less birds in there. And I guess this is the driving range at the golf course. And then this is the road up to the sewage ponds, or the treatment ponds.
And
There's
something
a soccer field there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
local people, the airport during in that round
Right
part,
here.
the airport there. And so we call it the beak of the bird going to the
No,
middle.
that's, yeah, it looks exactly
So
like
it just looks like a bird kind of going there, and so
Got
there's
a
the
big
butterfly
gullet.
of Santa Benicia and the beak of the bird of the north and south fork of Gallinas Creek, and it's sort of a quick way to recognize these things from the air.
And I appreciate people interjecting information like that. That's good to know. I'm not, I don't have a prepared speech, so that's helpful. But I did want to show just how broad the marshes are here and how narrow they get further upstream. Until you get over to what we call the movie theater marsh over here, which is quite broad behind Smith Ranch movie theaters. And that will become important later in this story. So the habitat requirements, these guys, one of the reasons they're endangered, they're specifists. They're very specific in their needs. And they need fully tidal saline to brackish marshes and the foreshores, that's the edges of the slough or the bay. Well-developed channel systems which occur in marshes that are particularly large and old. Like channels take a long time to form, so that's their habitat is channels that go through marsh, especially several order channels when it goes, there's little channels that drain into bigger channels, into the main channel. And they really like marshes where there's mature and youthful marsh overlapping, which is a typical marsh if it was left untouched. The outer edge is usually youthful and the upper edge is older, and it's accreting or growing out into the bay. Broad marshes, as we showed in the former slides, they like those broad marshes at the bay shore. And I think I'll repeat this later, but that broad marsh that I showed you out on San Pablo Bay shore, we think is the source for clapper rails in the whole North Bay because it's a big population. And
Repeat Can you repeat that right now?
I will. I'll repeat it later. So that's a really important marsh, the Gallinas Creek marshes, especially on the bay shore because they're so large and extensive and they have the highest densities. I'll repeat that again too.
Jules, you skipped nesting habitat at or about?
I think I'm getting there. Hold on.
No, it was above. You just skipped it.
Oh, I did, right?
Third one.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Susan. And in these marshes, they need a variety of micro-elevational changes, especially the nesting habitat, which is right at the highest high water point of the year, and often at the headwater of a channel. So if you think of a channel as kind of a sinuous habitat, and up at the edge, there's often grindelia or gum plant. That's at the little high, just a micro-elevation difference from the rest of the marsh plain. That's what they need for nesting. Thank you for pointing that out. So broad marshes are their favorite habitat, and linear marshes do support clapper rails, but tend to be in lower densities. Just think of it as area. The area of a broad marsh is much greater than a linear marsh, so the territory in a linear marsh would be long and linear. And they also need size. So 100 hectares is about 240 acres. If you get the few marshes we have in the Bay Area that are that large, have the highest densities of rails. And that's why I was saying that the mouth of Gallinas Creek is a source. It's big with a lot of rails in it. And this is kind of a repeat of the earlier, but the densities tend to increase with channel density. The more channels are in the marsh, which means it's older and larger usually, the better habitat it is. And also density is positively correlated to aerial extent of contiguous marshlands. That just means if the marsh is near bigger marsh or very close to it, it's got higher densities of birds. And density is one measure of health of the population. So throughout the Bay Area, we've isolated a lot of marshes because with development putting in berms and riprap and roads and whatever, air strips, and as a result, those isolated marshes are much less viable habitat than those large contiguous marshes. And another real important factor in a tidal marsh is what we call high tide refugia. Around the edge of the marsh, these marshes are subject to inundation at certain times, and these birds do not like to get out of the marsh, but when they do, they need cover at the upper edge to hide out before the tide recedes. And otherwise they're preyed upon by various critters, whether it's hawks or foxes or dogs or whatever. So peripheral vegetation has become a very important part of marsh restoration projects, having usually native, but it doesn't have to be, but preferably native vegetation around that just that area above the highest high water, sort of a buffer zone for them. And also, another problem is mesopredator populations. By mesopredator, I mean things like medium-sized, like raccoons, skunks, rats, and we've subsidized the mesopredator populations in the Bay Area, as in every human environment, just with our trash and by suppressing coyotes and other large predators that other populations have grown. And they go out in the marsh and eat eggs, basically. And also boardwalks, fence lines, towers, and stakes increase probably predation by aerial predators like hawks and owls. Just an aside, in one marsh, Gary Page and I did a study in Corte-Madera Marsh in 1992, a year-long study, and we'd estimated 44 pair of clapper rail in that marsh, which is a pretty big population for that marsh, high density. And of that, we found 11 carcasses that we surmised were killed by barn owls, because there's a big boardwalk that goes in. Just about every morning we go out there and be another dead clapper rail in there. And that was the common nocturnal predator at the time. Next slide.
How does the boardwalk increase predation? Is it the...
That gives a place for things to roost and then carry the food and eat. It's simple access. Plus foxes can go out there. Foxes and raccoons and skunks, anything and people can access it. That's why the boardwalk's there, right? For access. Next slide, please. Rachel?
Sorry.
Hello, Rachel.
No, I'm reading. I'm rereading.
Well, you've got it on your computer now, so you can.
Sorry.
I said that they're most active at dawn and dusk. That means vocal activity. Around here we have semi-diurnal tides, so there's two high tides and two low tides in a 24-hour period generally. And my sense is that the rails are really cued into the tidal level, because when the tide gets high, they get quiet. You don't find them. They're hiding out in that peripheral vegetation or in a grindelia plant or wherever. But as the tide goes down, foraging opportunities arise and they go down into the sloughs. Next slide, please. And you all know how tides work, I think, but a couple times a year in the summer, right around June and midwinter, there are extremely high tides, what they've started calling king tides now, when the conditions are right, the moon and the sun are in the right position, and that's when the birds are most vulnerable because there's so much inundation. But I also think you can back it up. No, actually, this is fine. Just leave it there. They also time their nesting season to avoid that December, January high tide and the May, June high tide. So they start nesting very early. They start setting up territories and communicating with one another in late January, right after those flood tides, those spring tides. And that's when we start censusing them. By the way, to survey them, because they're endangered, their protocols are highly regulated by Fish and Wildlife Service. So there's this period when we census them from January 15th to April 15th, when they're most vocally active and when they're probably nesting. After April 15th, we're not allowed to play tapes or have as much intrusion into the marsh because they're on eggs and having chicks. So that's the period of most vocal activity. And sometimes if a nest fails, they'll nest again, a second nest, and that's kind of rare, but when it happens, it's after those May, June high tides. So they wait till after those flood tides in June, and then they'll nest again, and we've seen chicks out as late August and September that were that second brood. Next slide, please. So, as I said, the Fish and Wildlife Service has developed specific protocols for monitoring birds, and they vary depending on what the intent is. Oftentimes, if there's a project going to happen in a given area where we don't know whether the bird's there or not, we're just determining presence, absence. We'll have slightly different protocols than if we're doing population estimates, which are a little more intensive. Population estimates are to get a feeling of what the population of the whole in the whole Bay Area is doing. So in the presence-absence surveys, we usually use active surveys. That means playing a tape to elicit responses from birds. If we didn't know that there are no records for that site, or we didn't know they were there. But if you're doing a whole series of population estimates, by the protocols, you have to go out and do 3 passive surveys at any site first. And that means passive means don't play any tapes, don't try to elicit calls, just stand there and listen to the the activity of the birds based on their behavior. Then if there's no detections on the first 3 surveys, you can go out on the 4th or 5th one and have active surveys. In other words, play that tape like I just was playing here. And the birds, if they haven't responded earlier, will respond to that tape, usually. And then there are also, as I already mentioned, the seasonality factor. We have to do it in January to mid-April. Temporal considerations, we can't do it on a full moon. The tide can't be too high because that suppresses their behavior. Time of day is dawn or dusk. And if the weather is such that you couldn't hear as well because of the wind or the rain, we have to not do the census as well. So it's pretty tricky trying to schedule from January to April, trying to schedule censuses if you're covering large areas. Detectability is based on population density. That means in a marsh where there are a lot of birds, like at the mouth of Gallinas Creek, the birds call a lot. They have neighbors they have to communicate with. They get nervous about their territorial boundaries. But in small marshes where there's only 1 or 2 birds, there's no reason to call. Calling puts these birds at risk from to predation. They don't want to draw attention to themselves unless they have to. So in smaller marshes, we end up usually doing, after we've done some passive surveys, we do active surveys because the birds are just quiet anyway. So we have to elicit these responses. Disturbance issues. That's, again, by regulation, you don't just walk out into a marsh and play. We tend to play from levees. These tapes are listened from levees or somewhere that's not invading the marsh, not putting trails through the marsh and crushing vegetation. So, which is all a good thing. This all evolved in order to reduce the impacts on the rails by scientific inquiry. Next slide, please. So here we are at the area that I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight. This is where the distribution, these white dots here is the distribution of our listening stations along the north branch of Gallinas Creek. We have GACR means Gallinas Creek, STVE means St. Vincent's, Santa Venetia, excuse me. But I'm going to really focus on the area between Contempo, Marin, and the edge of the golf course, because this is the area that's suffering or experiencing so much impact right now. So every 200 meters is a listening station, right? So we got about 6 listening stations in that stretch of creek. And 6 is about all one person can cover in the morning, because at each station, I didn't say this, you have to stand there for 10 minutes silently before you play a tape anyway. So it takes a while. And the vocal activity is only going on for about 90 minutes, from just before dawn to just after dawn. So one of the many projects that's happening along North Branch of Gallinas Creek is the county's master plan for the sports center and sports fields down here. And I will say that the county, as a public agency, is pretty responsible trying to figure out how to do these projects they want to do with having minimum impact on the rails. So they've been studying this for a long time. But what this shows is, and you probably can't see it, but I'll try to point them out. So there are a bunch of different dots out here, different colors. Can you see those? One there, one there, one there, one there, and one there, one there. These are all rail detections. And the green is the areas where there are a lot of rails. There are a lot of detections and there are too many to have dots. And again, that's broad marshes out near Santa Venetia, near the mouth, and back near the Smith Ranch theaters back there. So those places support a lot. These linear marshes that connect them have several important reasons. In a good year, or when there's not too much disturbance, several pairs will breed in that linear portion of the marsh. And it also provides connectivity between these two higher value marshes. So at the end of the breeding season, for example, if young birds have to disperse, get away from their parental territory, they'll use that to get up to another territory, or vice versa, go downstream or upstream. But these dots are important because they show detectability over the years. So the white dots, I can't even see them right well, but I think I know. The white dots here, 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 that's actually yellow. Well, the white dots are 2010, where we had detections of territorial males. We haven't done this every year because of funding constraints. The yellow dots, let's see, I'm sorry, the yellow dots were this one, and this one was 2011. The white dots is 2010, right there and there. And then the orange dots is 2014. 2014, the orange dots. And the green dots are out here. These are the most recent ones, 2016. And the point of this is that the birds were pretty, not common, but they were detected in this reach. And this project hasn't happened yet, but other ones have, which I'll talk about. Were detected in this reach prior to 2012. And after then, we've only had them out near these larger, out near the mouth further and way back here. So the only recent detections we've had this year, last year, 2016, were out here. And 2017 hasn't been plotted on this map yet, but there were no detections in this whole reach during 2017. And again, this hasn't happened yet. What has happened in that period? The Smart Train crossing was put in 2012. There's been some activity here for this. There's going to be a sports center here, as you probably know, or somewhere in here. I don't know exactly where it is, but it's going to impact this area. And you can never prove that a disturbance caused anything, but the correlation is there. There are basically no birds using this stretch of marsh during the breeding season, this is, in the last 2 years. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? So this, I think I'll come to a slide later, but we've come up with some attempted ways to avoid or minimize disturbance along the stretch, for at least for this project. The sports center project has been approved, I guess, already, and we tried to make some suggestions of how to avoid that, and I think the next slide may show that. It'll come up. Anyway, there's a whole slew of, or suite, I should say, of methods to try to avoid disturbance. One is avoid the nesting season, which contractors hate that because it means they can't start really till September, and they have to have the loud noise making, earth moving, things like that. They can't start till September, and they have to stop by January, according to Fish and Wildlife Service. And then there's ideas like putting sound barriers up along the edge of the marsh so that if they do have high volume construction activity, it doesn't extend into the marsh. And that's a little tricky because you're putting up a barrier, excludes other things from movement. So this is a summary of a biological assessment we did for this McGinnis Park project that has not happened yet, but is in planning. And I won't read the whole thing, but it just reiterates what I was saying about how this is important marshland for clapper rail populations. And as many others have said, these researchers here, everybody who looked at it said that San Pablo Bay marshes and perhaps the entire San Francisco Bay system are supported by this largest surviving population of California Ridgway's rails. It's a source population. Smaller marshes tend to be sinks, or can be sinks. In other words, the birds that breed there aren't very successful. Larger marshes produce more young, and so they produce individuals that go out and explore other territory and find other places to nest.
So is that in the long run important for genetic diversity?
Absolutely, yeah. We'll talk about metapopulation effects in a minute, but not only genetic diversity, outbreeding, basically, because things have to move. And although these guys are sedentary, and with most sedentary species it's true, the young of the year or the young are the ones that disperse and find new mates and don't mate with their cousins.
Jules,
yes?
I'm not familiar with the McGinnis Park project.
It's the county, and those soccer fields that are out there?
Yeah.
It's available on the county website, I'm sure.
Probably.
They're reconfiguring. It's a big project. They're moving the road, which I guess is a good thing, further from the marsh. But they're expanding the field access out there for soccer fields.
But it's not putting up big buildings?
No. It's all ground moving, but that has impacts too,
It
of course.
does,
As far as I know, there's no plan for any building changes out there, but it's moving the dog park back, I think, which is a whole other issue with the dog owners, and increasing the sizes and extent of the playing fields. But they're going through a long process and trying to figure this out. And the main one in that case, because it's a lot of earth moving, is noise harassment. So they're trying to get the contractors to put mufflers on big machines, not use backup beepers, which is a real major, those perennial, perpetual, well, the train, yeah, there you go, which is, perpetual. What does this all say? Yeah, I just said this. So the population, when at the Bay Shore, which is a source, tends to disperse up Gallinas Creek, as does the movie theater marsh. They tend to go downstream.
I'm sorry, Jules, the movie theater marsh populations, are they comparable to
The densities are comparable. There are a lot of birds back there. Probably 10 pair back in there. And there's, it's not as large as the outboard marshes there, but there are a lot of birds in there, and there have been forever, 30 years anyway. So there's a section, I don't have a picture of, there's a section of marshes, the eastern portion of that marsh that's the most productive. About 3/4 of the marsh. And we can talk about that more later if you want. So anyway, in some of the initial EIRs for the sports, what's the official name of it? The San Rafael Sports Palace. Yeah, that's what you call it.
That's what we call it, yeah.
The sports center over there. They downplayed that linear, in the EIR, that linear portion of the creek, saying that, well, the upstream and downstream areas are important for the birds. Hi. Come in. Are important for the birds, but that was marginal habitat, in which I wrote a whole thing for Marine Audubon, I think, disputing that. But it got approved ultimately. Next slide, please. So when I started to put this slide together, I was thinking, okay, I'm going to put anthropogenic disturbances and others, and realize they're all anthropogenic, really. I mean, they're human-caused, all these things. The most pressing one, because it's immediate, is construction activity associated with the airport recreational facility, the SMART train, which has already happened and will be ongoing, the McGinnis Sports Fields, that's the county one I was just talking about, and the only one I'm in favor of is McGinnis Marsh Restoration, which is Rachel and Greg's project, and might actually increase the availability of habitat for Ridgway trails rather than decrease it. Other one is recreational disturbance. Boating up and down, probably not a huge problem if it's canoes, but any motorboats and all is noise. The more noise, it's cumulative with the SMART train and the boats and people's voices. It suppresses it limits the amount of time the birds can devote to nesting and communicating with one another.
Do we add soccer to that list?
Et cetera is right there, I think. Says balls right there. And also birding and photography, while fairly benign pastimes, there's always some portion of the population that wants to get closer. Len, of course, doesn't do this, but gets closer to the birds, or closer to the bird to look at it or to photograph it. And there's some degree of disturbance. I think I misspelled a word here. Some level of disturbance just by recreational. Just by people being in there. As far as the recreational facility goes, night lighting is one thing we made sure they don't put in, because that increases the ability of predators, especially eyesight predators like raccoons, to find the rails. Noise disturbance, intrusion of people. These are all obvious things that limit the ability of these birds to reproduce and survive. And I mentioned this earlier, but I'll repeat it. Predation. Mesopredators are a huge problem, especially feral cats, rats, and then the skunks and raccoons, which are pretty adept at finding eggs and nests in the marsh, and probably account for a large portion of the disturbance or the population declines we've noticed. Habitat modification is a huge problem throughout the bay, not just Gallinas Creek, but we tend to put, it's a flat area, it's easy to put paths in and riprap so that the high tides don't flood the golf course or whatever's near the agricultural fields. So habitat modification is a problem. And then, as Susan was mentioning earlier, genetic diversity, the isolation of populations due to fragmentation Again, we've chopped up these once extensive habitats into small islands, so it's harder for individuals to communicate between sites, and that has an impact on reproductive success and ultimately population dynamics. And I've alluded to the fact that some areas, usually the large ones that are well channelized, are sources, other ones are sinks. One example, I think, of a sink effect is, if many of you are familiar with the non-native plants, it's the next line here, non-native plants in the bay. There's one, a non-native spartina that was inadvertently introduced at Creekside Marsh in Corte Madera, and has since spread throughout the South Bay particularly. And these plants attract, because they're sort of mimic the native cordgrass that lines the creeks. They attract rails because they seem like proper habitat, particularly when they're young. As it gets older, they invade out into the mudflats and the higher elevation and change the complexity of the vegetative community in the marsh. And therefore, there's a huge effort to try to control spartina, which is kind of controversial because there's a lot of birds in those non-native spartina marshes, at least at first. But the thinking is that it's going to change the whole ecology of the tidal marsh ultimately. So, and whether or not it's a sink, that is a population sink, in other words, birds are attracted there and then don't reproduce well there, is another question that people are trying to figure out right now. Contamination, of course, for all wildlife, but certainly a lot of things end up in the marsh because of the flow of water and where it settles out. And organic chlorines have been found in clapper rail eggs, mercury, lead, and of course oil spills are a problem. In subsidence in the South Bay, they're estimating that the tidal marshes have subsided up to 1 meter since 1860. And so that's less elevated marshlands. And correct me if I'm wrong, if I say something wrong. I have a hydrologist in the audience. You always have to watch yourself. And of course, sea level rise, because these marshes are bound at the upper edge or confined by infrastructure. As the sea level rises, there's very little room for these marshes to grow or to move upland as they would in a natural situation. In that paper that Rachel referred to, we looked at Marin County and tried to identify areas where there was potential for tidal marshes to expand and where it was impossible. And it turns out that out near Belmarin Keys, there's some nice habitat. And of course, I'll get to that in a minute. Next please. So, as I referred to earlier, the recreational facility at the airport did a biological assessment that was very dismissive of the clapper rail, at the time called clapper rails, and said that the creek did not represent a viable population, that the birds were likely habituated to human use, which there's no proof of that at all. And there are a lot of studies of habituation that shows just because animals are present when there's disturbance doesn't mean that they do well reproductively. And as a matter of fact, just the opposite. It tends to suppress their reproductive ability. This is the recovery plan. I was talking about the protocols earlier. This came out a couple of years ago in which they tightened up our protocols for us surveying the birds, and explicitly states that all clapper rails may occur in areas with high levels of human-related disturbance. The effects of disturbance on rails is unknown and potentially significant. Because most of these marshes are subjected to a variety of uses, the cumulative detrimental effects may be appreciable. Numerous routine activities have the potential to adversely affect individual rails and overpopulation. Well, that's couched in probability theory, those statements, but I think this middle reach of Gallinas Creek is a real object lesson in an area where there's some multiple disturbances that it probably is going to have an impact. Not only the pre-existing ones, but now the smart trains that are making noise, will be making noise continually, and these other developments as well. Next one, please. So we've come up with a lot of recommendations when there are. A lot of these projects get approved regardless, of course, of endangered species impacts. And we've made a lot of suggestions in just about every project that I've been involved in how to do it. Noise abatement will restrict the construction timing, especially high decibel equipment. There's been a lot of work done on what they call, the Fish and Wildlife Service calls harassment by high decibel equipment, especially with marbled murrelets and northern spotted owls. They have they haven't focused on rails so much, but being roughly the same size and sensitivity, we assume the same distances. Yes, same impact.
So you're talking about construction and the noise disturbing the birds, but what if the construction involves something like pounding sheet pile pounding and shaking the ground?
Yeah, that too. Yeah, and that. Some of you may know how the permitting for the Smart Bridge went through, how it was studied. But we did work on the one across the Petaluma Slough, right in the town of Petaluma, and it was a thorough study of that, and actually recommended no pile driving and auguring instead of pile driving. I don't think any of that would happen for this one at Gallinas Creek, didn't it?
No.
How did that happen? They just ignored it.
Don't care.
I don't know anything about the permitting of that bridge.
Yeah,
Does anyone
I
else
looked
in
for it.
the
I couldn't
watershed
find any
council?
permit.
I have videos of it if
I
anyone
mean, we know
of
that
the
it
pile
got
driving.
done.
Right, but there was
Yeah.
they didn't go through the permitting process, and I don't know how that
No,
happened.
they broke another law too, tearing up the rails. I mean, not the clapper rails, but the old railroad ties
Right.
in February when they weren't supposed to.
Yeah.
I reported that.
Yeah, I actually saw that when I was looking for the permits.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. So if there is high decibel or impactful noise, vibrations being made, it should be done at least in the non-nesting season, September to January. But even that's just sort of, a Solomonic choice, because they're still vulnerable, although they're not nesting then. Limit high frequency sounds, the backup beepers, I mentioned that. And I also mentioned this, consider a temporary sound barrier. That's been done with some effectiveness, not with rails, but other species at some construction sites. But the best thing to mitigate, if we can use that word, harassment, is restoration of tidal marshes, something that Rachel's working on out there on the other side, on the north side of the creek, and Rachel and Greg. And we've just another anecdote about restoration. We faced Army Corps of Engineers with other people restored at the mouth of the Petaluma River what's called Sonoma Baylands Marsh in 1996, and we started monitoring it in 1997. And one of the goals, among many others, was to increase the extent of the tidal marsh in the restored area. It's about 500 acres, and have it colonized by California clapper rails, Ridgway Trail, and California black rails. Black rails came in about 5 years. As soon as there was enough vegetation, we started detecting black rails in there. Last year, we had breeding clapper rails for the first time. It was year 19 after restoration. Oh, and the goal was 20 years, which was amazing. And this year, the person who did the surveys out there, I think it was either Point Blue or it might have been U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, had up to 16 clapper rails in that marsh. So that's restoration is the key. Restore all these places that have been destroyed and build it and they will come, essentially. Next one, please. So that's this only goes through about 2008, but that's the population estimate of Ridgway's rail, how it's declined. And a lot of things have been going on, urbanization of the Bay Area. It's hard to imagine it increased that much, but there was also the invasive spartina that was controlled. There was, a lot of various impacts, and probably the population dynamics. There might be something else going on besides contamination and disturbance, but we don't really know what they are. So that's right now we've sort of leveled off here, and actually we have data for the last 4 years, and there seems to be, although it's not statistically significant yet, there seems to be an upward trend the last few years, and we're hoping it's real. So we'll see. It could be some natural variation that's going on, because these birds are ground nesters. They lay a lot of eggs, and some years they're successful and some years not, but they're fairly long-lived. So if they have a couple of bad years, there might be a year when they can get off, half a dozen chicks or 9 chicks instead of 0. Yes, Rachel.
Is that San Francisco Bay Area population?
This is the whole population, yeah, the whole bay, not Gallinas Creek. So it was up to about 4,500, and now it's down to just above 1,000. This is estimation; it's not a count, but still. Next one, please. So I wanted to end sort of on a positive note. The California black rail, which likes higher marsh than the sloughs that the clapper rail habituates, seems to have been doing well. I think part of this is also that our ability to detect them has increased pretty dramatically. But at the same, and we're doing a lot of coverage, but this is, we've sort of accounted for that in this graphic here. And they do seem to be doing well. As a matter of fact, this year was interesting. And we do an annual survey out of Benicia Marsh in Solano County. And because of all the rain we had this year, there's a lot more habitat open for them in the upper edge of the marsh. We had 6 years of drought and it got really dry. These guys like damp substrate or wet marsh land. That seems to be what they need because there's higher invertebrate populations in that kind of habitat. So they were not doing so well, at least at my one study site, the last few years. But this year they're abundant, or last 2 years they're abundant. So that's kind of.
What is the vertical scale?
This one here. Oh yeah, I can't. That's birds per hectare.
Jules, are the black rails still more? Are there fewer of them than the Ridgways overall?
No, there are a lot more.
There are more black rails?
Not many more black rails. Yeah, we did an estimate about 6 years ago. We were in the 10 to 17,000 range. Of course, their habitat extends much further upstream. I didn't describe that earlier, but the Ridgway's rail basically stops at the Carquinez Straits. They're pretty rare in Sassoon Bay. Sassoon Bay's got great habitat for black rails, and they go all the way up, almost up to the Sacramento River. So they've got a lot more habitat available. I think there's one more slide. Nope. Try one more. No? I guess I forgot the last. Anyway, I wanted to end on a somewhat positive note. Any questions?
All of us with how they kind of come through on this design build schedule without great notification or anything, but how does the Endangered Species Act apply here? Is there any way, God help us with the current administration, but
it should apply.
It should apply.
And the local municipalities should be held accountable. Somebody has to sue them to get that to happen. I understand. I'm not a
I am one, so that's why I'm asking.
Pardon?
But I am in politics, so that's why I'm asking. But, so you actually just have to sue them to make it.
I guess so. Yeah.
The regulatory agencies won't take that stand.
Well, they have a lot. The one I deal with is Fish and Wildlife Service the most, and they have a lot on their plate. And a small project like this may not get to the top of the queue. It probably won't. They got much larger. They have U.S. forest plan, the forest plans and things like that. That's what they seem to put their energy into. And little sites like this, which one of the things I appreciate about a watershed council like you guys do. I used to be on the Tomales Bay one. They're your local knowledge and your watchdogs, and you can put the pressure on because you know what's going on and you see it. So.
Yeah, short of suing, we haven't seen that pressure seems to matter.
No, I know.
Politics is there to pull a train through.
Yeah.
Earth Justice is a good group to get to work with. It's a Sierra Club's environmental arm. They got a lot on their plate as well.
Yeah, they do.
Is there a case for filing a supplemental EIR? Like in the case with the airport soccer complex, they haven't really done much for many years after approval.
Right.
And things have changed, so wouldn't that trigger the need for a supplemental EIR?
I believe so, yes. But you have to pressure for that. Nobody's going to voluntarily do it.
Yeah.
Other questions, comments, thoughts? Yes.
I would like to hear if you could speak to the interface of the keystone species like salmon, especially the coho that are endangered, and the rails. How is that interrelated, and are you all working together in some way to try and? Well,
this concept of keystone species I think is important. So by putting a lot of energy in protecting the Ridgway's whale, for example, you're protecting a whole suite of characters, of habitat characteristics that help black rails, help salt marsh harvest mice, probably help salmon because they're reared in some of these habitats. So that's the idea. It's sort of an umbrella species, as wolves are as well in the Northwest. Yes.
Just trying to put together a couple things you just said today. One, when I think it was the San Rafael City Council that approved the airport soccer field. And you said since that time, the population along that strip of the Ridgway whale has disappeared.
Pretty much, yeah. We have no detections this year.
So and yet they haven't started any construction. So,
Well,
are
actually,
you-
they have been doing some
Have they?
road moving and, right, John?
They built a new bridge over the old train.
but that was smart.
Yeah, that and
There's
the
Okay.
soccer complex built
Okay.
another bridge over. Yeah.
Somebody has to take the initiative to pressure them to do a supplemental EIR, for example, if time has passed. And you know,
And conditions have worsened.
yeah, watershed councils are great people to do that.
Okay.
No pressure, but, you know,
No,
yes.
not at all.
So I kind of ignorant about birds, and I'm embarrassed to ask this in front of so many people in the yard, but when they're nesting, do they use, is it one egg that they're sitting on, or is there multiple eggs?
Ground nesting birds like the Ridgway's rail and quail is another example who are related, lay a lot of eggs, maybe half a dozen to a dozen eggs. And evolutionarily they have to, because they lose so many of their eggs to predators or whatever. So, you know, they get a lot of chicks out, and many of them won't survive if they even hatch in the first place. So that's, but they do lay a lot of eggs, not just one. And they sit tight through the whole incubation period unless they're flushed off the nest, which what's happened when there's disturbance, and then they're less likely to fledge all these chicks or hatch all these chicks. Yes.
Is the salt harvest marsh cohabitate with the rails, or do they go after their eggs, or is that a
The
problem?
salt marsh harvest mouse? No, they don't eat eggs. They're tiny. They don't. No, actually the rails will eat them. Any other comments? Yes.
What is the impact of crows?
Yeah, crows, well, as you know, corvids in general, crows. Ravens are probably more of a problem in marshes. As a matter of fact, I was talking about Benicia State Park marsh we're studying. We never see ravens there. This year, there are a lot of black rails there. Ravens are hunting in the marsh. They're just walk through very patiently. It's interesting, predation, you know, nobody really thinks about this much, but egrets and herons are big predators of the smaller, the black rails. And so,
Especially cattle egrets, which aren't native.
right, cattle egrets don't go in the marsh as much as more great egrets. And on those flood tides I was talking about, we used to study, and not clapper rails, they're too big for those guys, but black rails. At Tomales Bay, we have a population of black rails, and it became an annual event. On any of those flood tides, people would go out there to watch the great egrets and the great blue herons sort of line the edge of the marsh, and as the birds are forced up out, and birds and rodents forced up out of the marsh, they pick them off. It's kind of interesting.
They will, sorry.
Go.
It's, I guess I was speaking, like you're in a very unusually wildish place compared to where most of us are,
Mhm.
and where probably most of these birds are having to fend for themselves too. So, I mean, I just was wondering about crows, because I see them literally like the hawk population. I watched the hawk population and the red-tails decline enormously, and watch the crows and dog them.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if you had noticed on your maybe more urban populations.
In the marshes, I haven't noticed crow predation, but I've certainly noticed the increase in crows. Yeah, I live in Portland part-time, and the crow populations there is incredible. I mean, it's like they stream by our house at night. They go roost downtown, and then they mostly go out into agricultural fields, and there's less and less agricultural fields around here, so I'm not sure what they're preying on here.
We also know that WildCare has said that almost every hawk that comes in and gets tested has rodenticide in their blood.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's really causing a decline. So
Right.
people are putting out traps, bait for the rats. It's causing
Right, right.
havoc there.
Right, rodenticide's a
Wow.
huge problem. Spotted owls too. Yeah.
What's the lifespan of a rail?
Bird lifespan tends to be based on size, and we have, first of all, because they're endangered, it limits the amount of research you can do. We don't ban them very much. Somebody does, but they probably live to be about 12 years, I would guess, on their size. An osprey lives to be about 20 years. Rails lives to be 10, let's say 10 years, and the little songbird much less. Although, another anecdote, we banded a warbling vireo, which weighs about 6 grams, in 1973, and they migrate to Central America, and we caught it every year for the next 13 years in the same net. So then we were saying, land birds only live to be about 3 or 4 years old, but on occasion some live longer, I think.
How old are they before they sexually mature?
They're after a year, they're pretty quick, yeah. Unlike bald eagles, for example, which are 4 years, 3 or 4 years. Yes.
So, again, sorry, I'll keep asking questions. We've seen the results here of your research. Where else is it going?
Well, you know.
Where else, I mean,
Yeah,
we need to distribute this
goes to
around.
Fish and Wildlife Service, and they make their determinations based on population trends. And so when they see, you know, the decline in the clapper, that one slide I showed from the State of the Estuary conference, they see a decline like that, it gets their attention. And they put more resource, they drive the resources there. But of course, they have limited resources, so they go where it's most needed or where the loudest voices are also. So that's a blessing and a problem. Yes, Rachel.
Who at the Fish and Wildlife Service would be reading this report from McGinnis Park? Do you know?
Catherine's son, right now. They go through a lot of changes, though. She's been very responsive, and I can send you a couple other names. It goes through a hierarchy. She'll get it, and if it's important enough, she'll put it to the next, what's his name, Ola. I'll send you a list of people.
Okay. No, I'm not trying to put you on the spot,
No.
except to say that I think that, you know, as the Watershed Council, we want to reinforce the importance of your report and make it clear to the service that the public is well aware and that we are relying on them.
Right. And so it'll go to the regional office, which she happens to be the most responsive person there who gets it and reads it.
Great.
And then she'll put it up to, you know, the district office or the California office. And then it goes to Portland after that.
And
if
if we
it
go to
gets
Portland,
that far.
I guess.
Yeah.
And then the second question I have, Jules, is that you indicated that it's very difficult to connect cause and response when you look at this. And you also said that rails nest at the headwater limit of tidal marsh.
That was a general
generally,
statement, yeah.
wherever their population resides. We know with the smart track construction, the smart station construction, the improvements around the civic center associated with all of that development, that we have essentially taken a soft edge and made it rock hard
Right.
along the entire length
We
of
continue to
this
do that.
corridor within the watershed.
Right.
And yet we have yet to see any attention paid or mitigation for that upland transitional upland impact in the
Right.
context of sea level rise. So we know that impact grows.
Right.
And we, so to get to the question is, how do we emphasize that further? How do we raise attention here?
Well,
for
it
your
seems to
work?
me in the literature it's been emphasized.
I
dramatically.
know.
It's getting eyes on, you know, on it from whoever you can find in
I
person.
mean, the history of the literature
Yeah.
is so deep there,
Yeah.
and your work is so clear.
It's pretty clear. Yeah.
How do we move it along? I guess that's something for the council.
we all want to know.
Elect officials who are responsive.
Pay attention, yeah. Aren't asleep in
Yeah.
class.
So we're seeing some wetlands restoration like Hamilton, and I know Rachel's working at McGinnis on doing one. Are these restorations creating habitat where the birds might be able to start coming back?
I tried to use Sonoma Baylands as an example. That's exactly what happened there. You know, without getting into the weeds too much, that had subsided because of agricultural use. It had gone down a couple feet, I think a couple meters maybe. They took the dredge spoils from Oakland in 1996 and filled it back up to the right elevations for tidal marsh after segregating out the contaminated spoils. And then just opened up the floodgate. Breached the dikes, and the tides came in, and it took 20 years, but it's pretty. Looks like pristine marsh now. Not pristine, but it's fully vegetated, and channels are starting to develop pretty well. It also happens to be adjacent to an outboard marsh that was in really good shape, a large outboard marsh. So it's just basically increased the habitat landward from the existing marsh, and it's kind of an object lesson, I think, in how it should be done. And the one Rachel's working on is the same concept. It's got a great marsh on the outside, and hopefully it'll expand inward.
And I really appreciate all that, Jules, but Jules is working with me on the project, and we do what Jules said.
No,
So.
it's the other way around.
He says it should look like this over here, and that's what we try and do.